The Galactic Academy's Survival Studies course had a reputation that preceded it like a bad smell. Not because it was particularly difficult, mind you, but because it was taught by Professor Vextall, a 7-foot-tall reptilian with scales that shifted color based on his mood and an ego the size of a small moon. Today those scales were a particularly smug shade of emerald green as he stalked around his classroom, claws clicking against the polished metal floor. Survival, he announced to his diverse collection of students, drawing out the word like it personally offended him, is a concept that separates the civilized from the primitive. We, as advanced beings, have evolved beyond such crude necessities. In the front row, Zephyr fluffed her bright blue feathers nervously. The Aviaran exchange student had hollow bones and reflexes that could dodge a photon torpedo, but the way Professor Vextall talked about survival made it sound like some kind of ancient torture ritual. Her species had mastered interstellar flight 3 millennia ago after all. What could they possibly need to know about roughing it? Behind her, Kordak crossed his massive stone arms with a grinding sound that made everyone wince. The lithoid was essentially a walking boulder with delusions of grandeur, and he'd been bragging for weeks about how his people had conquered 17 star systems without breaking a sweat. Of course, when you're made of living rock, sweating isn't really an option, but nobody had the heart to point that out. In the corner, Bramble was doing that thing where he photosynthesized his anxiety, his leafy appendages turning a worried shade of yellow-green. The Floranian had spent most of the semester trying to convince everyone that plants were the superior life form, but right now he looked about as confident as a daisy in a hurricane. And then there was Quinn. The human sat in the back, looking remarkably unremarkable compared to his classmates. No scales, no feathers, no bark, no impressive mineral composition, just basic bipedal mammalian architecture, with opposable thumbs and what Professor Vextall had once dismissively called primitive survival instincts left over from their cave-dwelling ancestors. Quinn was taking notes. Actual notes. With an actual pencil, on actual paper. Professor Vextall's scales shifted to a more orange hue as he continued his lecture. However, the Academy in its infinite wisdom requires that we understand these barbaric practices, if only to appreciate how far we've come. Which brings me to your final examination. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that usually preceded either profound wisdom or complete disaster. You will be spending the next 24 hours on Kepler 442c, a primitive forest world with no technological infrastructure. No communicators, no replicators, no atmospheric processors, just you, your wits, and whatever passes for survival instincts in your respective species. Zephyr's feathers immediately stood on end. Kordak's confident expression cracked like rock. Bramble started muttering something about insufficient sunlight for optimal photosynthesis. Quinn just kept taking notes. Surely, Professor, Zephyr chirped, her voice hitting frequencies that made the windows vibrate. This is just theoretical, right? I mean, we're advanced civilizations. We have environmental suits, portable habitats, emergency beacons, all of which will remain here. Professor Vextall replied with the kind of smile that suggested he was enjoying this far too much. The transport leaves in 1 hour. I suggest you say goodbye to your creature comforts. Tomorrow, we separate the evolved from the primitive. As the class filed out in various states of panic, Quinn calmly closed his notebook and stretched. Just another day at Space College, apparently. The transport ship dumped them on Kepler 442c with all the ceremony of taking out the trash. 1 minute they were arguing about who would be the first to die. The next they were standing in a forest clearing, watching their ride disappear into the atmosphere with a cheerful little wave from the pilot. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. We're all going to die, Bramble announced with the kind of certainty usually reserved for mathematical theorems. His leaves had turned a pale sickly green that definitely wasn't photosynthesis related. This planet is teeming with predators. I can sense them, watching us, waiting. Predators. Zephyr's voice shot up 2 octaves, which in Aviaran terms meant she was approaching panic frequency. What kind of predators? Are they large? Do they hunt in packs? Can they fly? Oh no, what if they can fly faster than me? Kordak puffed out his chest, which involved rearranging several tons of living granite. Calm yourselves. I am Kordak of the Lithoid Confederation. My people have conquered star systems. A few primitive beasts are hardly a concern for someone of my geological superiority. Right on cue, a squirrel chittered at him from a nearby tree. Kordak immediately took 3 steps backward. Did you hear that? It's communicating. Possibly calling for reinforcements. While his classmates spiraled into increasingly creative forms of hysteria, Quinn was walking around the clearing like he was shopping for groceries. He picked up a stick, examined it, tossed it aside. grabbed a handful of dirt, sniffed it, nodded approvingly, walked over to a tree, and actually pressed his ear against the bark. "Quinn," Zephyr called out. "What are you doing? We need to stick together. Safety in numbers and all that." "Just getting oriented," Quinn replied, apparently having a conversation with a pile of rocks. He picked up several stones, weighed them in his hand, then slipped a few into his pockets. "Oriented?" Bramble's leaves rustled with confusion. "We're stranded on a death world with no technology, no shelter, and no food sources. What exactly are you orienting yourself toward? Our inevitable doom?" Quinn looked up from where he was now examining some kind of moss. "Actually, this isn't too bad. Decent water table based on the vegetation. Those berries over there are probably edible, and the soil composition suggests we're not too far from a stream. Could be worse." The three aliens stared at him like he'd just announced he was actually 3 space hamsters in a human suit. "How could you possibly know any of that?" Kordak rumbled. "You looked at dirt and talked to a tree. That's not advanced sensor analysis. That's primitive superstition." "Right," Quinn said, and went back to collecting random forest debris. "Primitive." Zephyr was pacing now, which involved a lot of nervous hopping and wing flapping. "We need a plan. A real plan, not whatever Quinn is doing. What do we know about survival situations from our theoretical studies?" "Well," Bramble said, his educational programming kicking in theoretically, "the first priority should be shelter, followed by water procurement, then food acquisition, and finally signal fire for rescue coordination." "Excellent," Kordak declared. "I will construct our shelter. Stand back while I demonstrate lithoid engineering superiority." He proceeded to pick up the largest rock he could find and drop it. Then he picked up another rock, and dropped it next to the first one. Then he stood back and admired his work. "Behold," he announced proudly, "fortification. 2 rocks, just sitting there, doing rock things." Zephyr tilted her head at an angle that would have been anatomically impossible for most species. "Kordak, that's just 2 rocks. Strategic rocks," he corrected. "Positioned for maximum defensive efficiency." Meanwhile, Quinn had wandered off toward the tree line, muttering something about checking the perimeter and reading sign, which made no sense, because as far as anyone knew, trees didn't have writing on them. "Where is he going?" Bramble asked, his anxiety levels causing his chlorophyll to shift toward brown. "We agreed to stick together. Safety in numbers, remember." "Maybe he's looking for help," Zephyr suggested hopefully. "Other survivors, or a settlement, or..." A tree branch cracked somewhere in the forest. All 3 aliens immediately huddled together behind Kordak's strategic rocks, which provided roughly the same amount of protection as a strongly worded letter. "He's been eaten," Bramble whispered. "The predators got him. We're next." Or Kordak said, trying to salvage some dignity. "He's gone to scout ahead. Reconnaissance mission." Very tactical. They waited, and waited, and waited. Some more. Quinn didn't come back. By the time the alien sun started its descent toward the horizon, the 3 remaining students had achieved new levels of collaborative dysfunction that would have impressed even Professor Vextal. "Right," Zephyr announced, puffing up her feathers in what she hoped was a leadership pose. "Clearly we're on our own now. Time to implement proper survival protocols." She immediately began gathering twigs with the systematic efficiency of someone who had read exactly 1 chapter about nest construction. The result looked like a beaver had given up halfway through a project and decided to pursue a career in modern art instead. "This is a nest," she declared, standing proudly next to what appeared to be a small pile of sadness held together by wishful thinking. Bramble examined the construction with the kind of diplomatic expression usually reserved for complimenting a friend's terrible haircut. "It's very organic," he offered. "It's a stick pile," Kordak rumbled from where he was engaged in what he called establishing territorial dominance. This involved him stomping around the clearing and occasionally glaring at trees that he suspected of judging him. "I'll have you know that Aviaron nest-building techniques have been refined over millions of years of evolution," Zephyr huffed, which caused several twigs to fall out of her masterpiece. "We've built structures that can withstand stellar windstorms. With technology," Bramble pointed out helpfully. "Advanced materials, gravitational anchors, molecular bonding agents. This is just sticks." While they debated the merits of stick architecture, Kordak had moved on to phase 2 of his survival plan, intimidating the local wildlife into submission. He'd identified a particularly threatening squirrel and was engaged in what he called psychological warfare. "You see this?" he rumbled at the squirrel, flexing his considerable rocky bulk. "Pure lithoid strength. Forged in the heart of dying stars, I have personally pulverized asteroids with my bare hands." The squirrel chittered back. "Don't you take that tone with me, fuzzy creature. I am Kordak the Mountainous, crusher of worlds, bane of the weak. The squirrel threw an acorn at his head. Kordak stumbled backward, arms windmilling for balance. Unprovoked assault. It's called for backup. Sure enough, 3 more squirrels appeared, and what followed could only be described as the least dignified chase scene in galactic history. Picture, if you will, several tons of living rock being pursued through a forest clearing by creatures that collectively weighed less than his left toe. Meanwhile, Bramble had decided to embrace his plant heritage and attempt survival through photosynthesis. There was just one small problem. Why is it so cloudy? He moaned, stretching his leaves toward a sun that kept playing hide and seek behind clouds. How do primitive plants survive with such inconsistent solar radiation? This is impossible. Maybe you could eat something, Zephyr suggested, taking a break from reinforcing her stick pile with more sticks. You know, like those berries Quinn was looking at. Bramble recoiled in horror. Eat something. I'm a plant. Plants don't eat things. That's barbaric. Plants eat nutrients from soil, she pointed out. That's different. That's absorption. Civilized absorption through root systems and chemical processes. Not this primitive mouth-based consumption you mobile species seem so fond of. As the day wore on, their situation became increasingly ridiculous. Zephyr's nest had collapsed twice, and was now held together primarily by determination and spiderwebs. Kordak had declared a temporary truce with the squirrels, but was clearly losing the psychological warfare battle. Bramble had managed to achieve roughly 3 minutes of productive photosynthesis before the clouds rolled back in. But it was around sunset that they began to hear the sounds, rhythmic, purposeful, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Thunk, thunk, thunk. What is that? Bramble whispered, his leaves rustling with anxiety. Predators, Zephyr said immediately. Large ones. With tools. Tools. Kordak had returned from his squirrel encounter looking significantly less confident about his geological superiority. What kind of primitive species uses tools? Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound was getting closer. Maybe it's Quinn, Zephyr suggested hopefully. Maybe he found help. Or built something. Humans are supposed to be good with primitive technology, right? Humans are barely civilized. Kordak scoffed, though he was backing toward the center of the clearing. Their entire species still uses combustion engines and chemical propulsion. They probably can't even make fire without technological assistance. Thunk. 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 Should we investigate? Bramble asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather photosynthesize himself into extinction than go anywhere near those sounds. Absolutely not, Zephyr said firmly. We stay here. We stick to the plan. We wait for rescue. They huddled together behind Kordak's strategic rocks, listening to the mysterious sounds echoing through the forest. Whatever was out there, it was working on something. Something big. Something that required a lot of rhythmic thunking. You know what? Bramble said, after a particularly long silence. I'm starting to think maybe Quinn had the right idea about exploring. At least he's not sitting here slowly starving to death while listening to ominous forest noises. He's probably dead, Kordak pointed out with characteristic optimism. Well, Zephyr sighed, tucking her head under one wing, at least he's not slowly dying of exposure while his nest falls apart for the 3rd time. The thunking continued well into the night, a steady rhythm that somehow managed to be both comforting and terrifying. Whatever was out there, it was persistent. It was organized. And it was definitely not giving up. None of them slept particularly well. Morning came with the kind of cheerful bird songs that seem specifically designed to mock people who've spent the night huddled behind rocks, questioning their life choices. The 3 aliens were in various states of misery. Zephyr's feathers looked like she'd been through a blender. Kordak had somehow managed to get moss growing on his north-facing side, and Bramble had turned a concerning shade of yellow that definitely wasn't photosynthesis related. The mysterious thunking had stopped sometime around dawn, replaced by what sounded like construction noises. Sawing, hammering, the occasional satisfied grunt of someone who knew what they were doing. Right, Zephyr announced, trying to project leadership while her nest collapsed for the 4th time. We need to investigate. Whatever's out there, we need to know if it's friendly, or if we should add it to our growing list of things trying to kill us. I volunteer Kordak for reconnaissance, Bramble said immediately. He's the most durable. I volunteer Bramble, Kordak countered. Plants are supposed to be one with nature or something. I volunteer both of you, Zephyr declared. I'll stay here and guard the camp. What camp? They both asked, looking around at what could generously be described as a small disaster area. Before anyone could volunteer anyone else for potentially fatal scouting missions, the sound of whistling drifted through the trees. Actual whistling. A tune. Someone was having a good time out there in the supposedly deadly wilderness. That's either very good news or very bad news, Bramble observed. With our luck, it's probably both, Zephyr muttered. They followed the sound through the forest, moving with all the stealth of a marching band having an argument. Branches snapped under Kordak's weight, Zephyr's nervous wing flapping scattered leaves everywhere, and Bramble kept getting caught on undergrowth and having to be untangled. But when they reached the source of the whistling, all thoughts of stealth evaporated completely. What in the 7 spiral arms of the galaxy is that? Kordak breathed. Rising from the forest floor like something out of a fairy tale was a structure that defied everything they thought they knew about primitive survival. It wasn't just a shelter, it was architecture. A multi-level treehouse that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood concepts like load-bearing beams and structural integrity and making things that don't fall down when you look at them funny. The main platform was built around a massive oak tree, easily 20 feet off the ground, with rope bridges connecting to smaller platforms on adjacent trees. There was a roof that actually looked waterproof, walls that appeared to be properly insulated, and what looked suspiciously like a functional drainage system for rainwater collection. And sitting on the main platform, casually weaving what appeared to be a basket out of forest materials, was Quinn. "Oh hey guys," he called down, as if finding 3 stunned aliens staring up at his forest mansion was the most normal thing in the world. "I was wondering when you'd make it over here. How'd the night go? How did Zephyr started, then stopped, then started again? How did you build this?" Quinn finished helpfully. "Yeah, it took most of yesterday, and this morning. Still got a few finishing touches to add, but it's basically move-in ready. Want to come up?" He dropped a rope ladder that unrolled with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested it had been properly engineered and tested. Because of course it had. The 3 aliens climbed up in a daze, Kordak causing the whole structure to sway ominously under his weight. But the treehouse held. More than held. It felt solid, stable, like it had been there for years instead of hours. "This is impossible," Bramble whispered, his leaves rustling with something that might have been awe. "You can't build something like this with primitive tools. Where did you get the materials? The fasteners? The structural components?" Quinn gestured around the platform. "Trees for lumber, vines for rope, stones for the foundation, clay from the riverbank for chinking. It's all right here, but the engineering," Kordak protested, running his rocky fingers along a joint that was so perfectly fitted it looked like it had been cut by precision laser. "The load calculations, the stress distribution, the environmental factors. You'd need advanced computational models to design something like this, or you could just know that wood is strong in compression and weak in tension, so you design accordingly," Quinn said, continuing to weave his basket like this was the most normal conversation in the universe. "Basic engineering principles. They teach this stuff in high school shop class." "High school," Zephyr's voice cracked. "You learned construction engineering in childhood education. Among other things. Want some breakfast? I've got fresh fish from the stream, some of those berries you were looking at yesterday, and I found a bee tree so there's honey if you want it." He gestured to what they now realized was an actual kitchen area, complete with a fire pit that had clearly been designed for optimal heat distribution and minimal smoke production. There were racks for drying food, containers for water storage, and what looked like a primitive but functional refrigeration system using evaporation cooling. "You have a kitchen," Bramble stated flatly. "In a tree. That you built. Overnight." "Well, most of the night," Quinn corrected. "Had to stop working when it got too dark to see properly. Safety first and all that." "Safety first," Kordak repeated slowly, as if the words didn't make sense in that order. Quinn was already moving on to the next impossible thing, which appeared to be a rain collection system that fed into carved wooden gutters. "Oh, and I set up some basic defensive positions in case there are any large predators in the area. Nothing too elaborate, just some early warning systems and fallback positions. Better safe than sorry." He pointed to what looked like an entire network of platforms, rope bridges, and what might have been primitive but effective alarm systems using balanced sticks and stones. "You built a fortress," Zephyr said weakly. "You built an entire fortress. In one night, using sticks and rocks." "I built a shelter with some basic defensive considerations," Quinn corrected. "A fortress would need proper walls, siege equipment, supply lines, and a command structure. This is just camping." The 3 aliens looked at each other, then back at Quinn, then around at the elaborate treehouse complex that he apparently considered just camping. "Quinn," Bramble asked carefully, "what exactly do you think camping is? You know, basic outdoor survival, shelter, water, food, fire, security. Standard stuff." He paused in his basket weaving. "Why, what do you guys think camping is?" "Suffering," Zephyr said immediately. Slow death by exposure while questioning your life choices. Ah, Quinn nodded sagely. Yeah, that's what happens when you don't know what you're doing. Want me to show you some basic techniques? Might come in handy for the rest of the test. And that's when they realized that Quinn wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was thriving in it. And somehow, he thought this was normal. Professor Vextel materialized in the clearing at precisely 1400 hours Standard Galactic Time with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd been practicing his entrance. His scales were a confident shade of gold, and he carried himself with the air of someone who was about to deliver a lecture on the superiority of civilized life over primitive barbarism. He expected to find traumatized students huddled together, possibly weeping, definitely ready to appreciate the wonders of modern technology and climate-controlled environments. He'd brought emergency blankets and hot soup, prepared to comfort his charges while explaining how this experience had taught them the value of their advanced society. What he found instead was a clearing that looked like it had been hit by a particularly organized hurricane. The transport pad was surrounded by what appeared to be the remnants of several failed engineering projects. There were sticks scattered everywhere in patterns that suggested someone had tried very hard to build something and failed spectacularly. A pile of rocks sat in what might have been an attempt at architectural significance. Leaves and moss were distributed in a way that implied desperate attempts at camouflage or possibly modern art. "Students," he called out, his scales shifting to a more concerned orange, "report for extraction immediately." The response came from above. "Up here, Professor," Quinn's voice called down from somewhere in the canopy. "Just finishing up a few last-minute improvements." Professor Vextal looked up and immediately experienced what philosophers call cognitive dissonance and everyone else calls what the actual hell is happening right now. Rising from the forest like something that belonged in an architectural magazine was a structure that challenged everything he thought he knew about primitive survival. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a compound. A village. A testament to engineering principles that he was pretty sure hadn't been invented yet by species this primitive. The main treehouse platform was now even more elaborate than it had been that morning. Quinn had apparently spent the day adding finishing touches that included what looked like a functional pulley system for hauling supplies, an expanded water collection network that fed into multiple storage containers, and what appeared to be a smokehouse for food preservation. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was the other three students. Zephyr was perched on one of the smaller platforms, carefully weaving what looked like a surprisingly competent basket under Quinn's patient instruction. Her feathers had been cleaned and properly arranged, and she was actually humming while she worked. Kordek was on the ground level, using his considerable strength to help Quinn position support beams for what appeared to be an expansion project. The massive lithoid was following the human's directions with something approaching reverence, occasionally asking questions about load distribution and structural engineering that suggested he was actually learning something. Most shocking of all was Bramble, who had somehow been convinced to try primitive nutrition supplementation and was currently sampling various forest foods while Quinn explained their nutritional properties and preparation methods. The plant being's color had returned to a healthy green, and he was taking notes. Actual notes. On bark paper that Quinn had apparently taught him to make. "Professor Vextal," Zephyr called down cheerfully. "Perfect timing. Quinn was just showing us how to construct a water wheel for the stream. Did you know that humans invented hydroelectric power using nothing but sticks and stones? It's fascinating." Professor Vextal's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a confused purple. "Students, report for immediate extraction. The test is concluded." "Oh, do we have to leave already?" Bramble asked, looking up from where he was grinding acorns into flour using a technique that Quinn had apparently demonstrated. "I was just starting to understand the fundamental principles of nutritional biochemistry as applied to wild food preparation. This is revolutionary." "Revolutionary?" Professor Vextal repeated weakly. "The applications are incredible." Kordek rumbled from where he was examining a joint in the treehouse construction. "Quinn has shown me engineering techniques that could revolutionize lithoid architecture. Did you know that organic materials can be stronger than processed metals when properly utilized? The tensile strength of plant fibers when woven in specific patterns exceeds our current manufacturing standards." Professor Vextal's world was beginning to tilt on its axis. "Students, you appear to be enjoying yourselves." "Enjoying ourselves?" Zephyr laughed, a sound that held no trace of her previous panic. "Professor, this has been the most educational experience of my academic career. Quinn has demonstrated practical applications of physics, chemistry, biology and engineering that make our theoretical studies look like children's games." "Theoretical studies," the professor repeated, his voice getting smaller. That's when Quinn appeared at the edge of the platform, rappelling down on a rope that he'd clearly made himself. He landed with the kind of casual grace that suggested this was just another Tuesday for him. "Hey Professor," Quinn said, dusting off his hands. "How'd we do? I know it's just a basic survival setup, but I figured it would be enough to get us through the test." Professor Vextall stared at the human student who had just referred to an elaborate forest compound as a basic survival setup. His scales were now cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages. "Basic," he managed. "Well yeah, I mean we only had 24 hours. Give me a week and I could have proper sanitation systems, maybe a small-scale manufacturing setup for tools and textiles. A month and we could have sustainable agriculture and renewable energy systems. But for a overnight camping trip this seemed adequate." "Camping trip," Professor Vextall whispered. Quinn Zephyr called down from her platform. "Should we show him the alarm system you set up? The one that detects approaching wildlife and automatically activates the defensive countermeasures." "Defensive countermeasures?" The professor's voice cracked. "Nothing harmful," Quinn assured him quickly. "Just noisemakers and barrier systems to encourage any large predators to find somewhere else to hunt. Peaceful coexistence with the local ecosystem and all that." Professor Vextall looked around at the clearing, then up at the treehouse complex, then at his students who were all looking at Quinn with expressions that he was starting to recognize as hero worship. "Quinn," he said carefully, "where exactly did you learn these skills?" "Oh, you know, scouts mostly, summer camp. My dad taught me some stuff when we went fishing. Basic human education stuff." Quinn shrugged. "Why, basic human education?" Professor Vextall repeated. "Yeah, most kids learn this kind of thing. Fire starting, shelter building, water purification, food identification, basic first aid, navigation without instruments. Standard curriculum." The professor's scales had settled into a shade of beige that suggested his entire worldview was currently being deconstructed and rebuilt from the ground up. "You teach wilderness survival to children. Well sure, how else would they learn? Can't always rely on technology, right? What happens if your ship breaks down on an uninhabited planet? Or if there's a natural disaster and the infrastructure fails? Or if you just want to go camping for fun?" Quinn looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "What do other species do in survival situations?" "Die," Bramble said helpfully. "Mostly we just die." Professor Vextall sat down heavily on one of Kordak's strategic rocks, which was still exactly where the lithoid had left it yesterday, still providing exactly 0 strategic value. "Let me understand this correctly," he said slowly. "Your species teaches survival engineering to children, as a standard educational requirement." "Among other things, yeah." "What other things?" Quinn thought for a moment. "Basic medical training, emergency response, critical thinking, problem solving, resource management, teamwork, leadership skills, physical fitness, mental resilience. You know, life skills." "Life skills," Professor Vextall echoed. "Right. Skills for staying alive and helping others do the same." Quinn looked around at the group. "I mean that's the point of education, isn't it? Learning how to survive and thrive in whatever environment you find yourself in." And that's when Professor Vextall realized that everything he thought he knew about primitive versus advanced civilization was not just wrong, but catastrophically, embarrassingly, completely backwards. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Academy looked like it had been hit by an educational revolution, which, in a sense, it had. The first sign that something fundamental had changed was the new course listings. Introduction to Practical Survival Engineering had a waiting list 3 semesters long. Basic Resource Management and Environmental Adaptation was oversubscribed by 400%. Primitive Technology Applications for Advanced Civilizations had become the most requested elective in Academy history. All taught by Quinn, who had somehow gone from exchange student to the most popular instructor on campus without technically graduating yet. The second sign was the queue outside his dorm room. At any given time, there were at least a dozen students from various species waiting to ask him questions like how do you make fire without a plasma igniter? And what's the optimal angle for a load-bearing beam constructed from organic materials? And is it true that humans can navigate using only stellar positions and basic mathematics? The third sign was Professor Vextall himself. The once pompous reptilian had enrolled in every single one of Quinn's courses. All of them. He sat in the front row, taking meticulous notes, asking earnest questions, and occasionally making embarrassing admissions like I always assumed shelter construction required industrial fabrication units, or how was I supposed to know that plants contain nutritional compounds that can be extracted through heating. His scales had permanently settled into a humble shade of muted brown, the color of someone whose entire professional identity had been gently but thoroughly demolished by a teenager with a Swiss Army knife and a basic understanding of physics. It's not your fault, Professor, Quinn had assured him during office hours, which were held in what was now called the Practical Learning Garden behind the academy. It was essentially a wilderness area where Quinn taught hands-on survival skills to students who had never imagined they might need to know the difference between edible and poisonous berries. I mean, your species never needed to learn this stuff. Quinn continued, demonstrating the proper technique for fire starting to a group of advanced engineering students who were taking notes like their lives depended on it. You went straight from primitive to spacefaring without that whole middle period where you had to figure out how to not die in the woods. Professor Vextel nodded eagerly, his new humility both touching and slightly disturbing to witness. But surely the applications are obvious once explained. The principles of leverage, thermodynamics, structural engineering, biochemistry, resource optimization, right, but you learned those as abstract concepts for building starships and terraforming planets. We learned them as things you need to know so you don't die while camping. Quinn grinned. Different motivation, same physics. The fourth sign of the educational revolution was the fundamental restructuring of the Academy's curriculum. Suddenly, every program required at least one course in applied survival sciences. The philosophy department had added practical problem-solving under resource constraints. The engineering program now included organic materials and primitive construction techniques. Even the art students were learning environmental aesthetics and functional design integration. But perhaps the most telling sign was the new entry requirement for the academy. Every prospective student, regardless of species, had to pass a basic survival competency test. Nothing too elaborate, just 24 hours in a controlled wilderness environment with minimal equipment. The failure rate was 97%. We're going to need to rethink our entire approach to education. Dean Quexthor had admitted during the emergency faculty meeting that had lasted 6 hours and involved a lot of uncomfortable realizations about the state of galactic civilization. Perhaps Professor Vextel had suggested quietly, we should consider the possibility that we've been defining advanced and primitive incorrectly. Which brought them to the present moment, where Quinn was demonstrating advanced knot-tying techniques to a mixed group of students and faculty, while casually dropping knowledge bombs that were reshaping their understanding of civilization itself. The thing is, Quinn said, securing a bowline hitch that could support several times his body weight using nothing but plant fiber rope, survival skills aren't really about survival. They're about problem solving, resource management, and adaptability. Same skills you need for running a starship, terraforming a planet, or building an interstellar civilization. But surely, Professor Vextel interjected, there's a difference between primitive survival techniques and advanced technological solutions. Quinn paused in his demonstration and looked around at the group of advanced beings who were hanging on his every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. Which, in a way, he was. Professor, he said gently, what do you think happens when your advanced technological solutions fail? The silence that followed was the sound of several dozen highly educated minds collectively realizing that their entire civilization was built on the assumption that technology would never fail, resources would never run out, and problems would always have technological solutions. Oh, Professor Vextel said in a very small voice. Yeah, Quinn nodded. That evening, as Quinn was heading back to his dorm after another day of inadvertently revolutionizing galactic education, he found Zephyr, Kordak, and Bramble waiting for him with expressions that suggested they had something important to discuss. Quinn, Zephyr began, her feathers ruffled with what he'd learned to recognize as her thinking hard pose, we've been talking, and we have a question. Shoot, that survival test, Kordak rumbled. The one that nearly killed us and made us question our entire existence as advanced beings. Yeah, for you, Bramble continued, his leaves rustling with something that might have been awe, that was really just basic camping knowledge. The kind of thing human children learn in school. Quinn considered this. Well, I mean maybe not the treehouse. That was probably more like intermediate camping. But yeah, basically. The three aliens exchanged glances. Quinn, Zephyr said carefully, what exactly do humans consider advanced camping? Quinn's grin was the kind that suggested his classmates were about to have their minds blown all over again. Well, he said, there's this thing called wilderness backpacking, where you carry everything you need for weeks of survival in a pack weighing less than 20 pounds, navigate, using dead reckoning across unmarked terrain, and emerge healthier than when you started. That's impossible, Bramble whispered. And then there's primitive skills camping where you make everything you need from scratch, using only materials you find on site. No tools, no equipment, no prepared materials, just knowledge and whatever's lying around. That's definitely impossible, Kordak said firmly. Oh, and winter survival camping, where you do all of this in sub-freezing temperatures with snow and ice storms. Professor Vextel, who had been eavesdropping from behind a nearby tree, made a small whimpering sound. But the really advanced stuff, Quinn continued, clearly enjoying himself now, is expedition camping. Multi-month wilderness treks across hostile terrain with complete self-sufficiency, real-time adaptation to changing environmental conditions, and zero technological backup. Please stop, Professor Vextel called out from behind his tree. My worldview can't take much more of this. Quinn laughed, the sound echoing across the campus where the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy were slowly coming to terms with the fact that they'd been completely wrong about what constituted survival skills, primitive technology, and the basic requirements for not dying in the universe. Don't worry, Professor, he called back. I'm sure your species will pick it up eventually. After all, humans figured it out, and we're supposed to be the primitive ones, right? The sound that came from behind the tree might have been crying, or possibly laughing. With Professor Vextel, it was getting harder to tell the difference. And somewhere in the distance, the Academy's Emergency Planning Committee was having a very serious discussion about what to do if their technology ever failed and they actually had to survive on their own. They were taking a lot of notes.